Hey, this is John. Thanks for joining me for this build of Bandai's HGUC Gouf Custom. This is a special build for me. The kit is actually one my son gave me for Christmas, so I'm really looking forward to this one, more so than just one that I picked up off the shelf myself. I always love going through a new kit right after you open the box and you get to see the parts and the instructions and, of course, pull all the sprues out of the loud crinkly paper. But examining the parts, ever since I was a kid, that's just been one of the things that I always look forward to on every new build. Just looking at the details and seeing what's there and what I've got to look forward to. My son bought this, he said, because of the big honking Gatling gun, so I'm really looking forward to that. When I remove parts from the sprue, I always use the 2-nip technique. I get my rough nippers and remove it and leave some plastic there on the part. And then I get my sharper side cutters and I just go in and I remove those little nubs. I find that helps reduce the damage to the plastic and the stress marks, and then I can just go in and sand it down. I like to start with a metal file because it doesn't round the edges off, and I'll go back later and clean it up. Tweezers are always handy to have. Sometimes there's little small parts and my fingers just can't get in there, so tweezers solve the problem for me fairly quick. And within just a few minutes, I've got the torso done. That's one of the great things about these Bandai kits. They go together very nicely. You will find a few seam lines, especially on the HG kits. But dealing with these is fairly simple. What I do is I make sure that the edges of the parts are good and smooth. And then I get some of my Tamiya extra thin cement. And I make the part push together just slightly, so that there's a bit of just a hairline crack between the two parts. And then I go in and I add some of the glue right there, and I let the capillary action pull the glue into the gap between the parts. And I don't go in with the glue very lightly. I put it on there. And then once it's in there, I can push the parts together, and when I squeeze them together, it pushes up a bead of melted plastic. That's one of the beauties of Tamiya extra thin cement. It's a welding cement. It actually melts the plastic. So when you squeeze that together and give it several hours, or I actually give it a couple of days to dry, you can then go in and clean up that bead of plastic, and you've got a nice smooth join. And once you paint over it, you won't see any hint that that was ever two parts. And pretty quickly the torso goes together. The only seams that I've had to deal with on this kit, on the upper torso, have been those on the shoulder pauldrons. So this is one of the just wonderful examples of the HGUC line of kits from Bandai that just go together so nicely. Yeah, way to go, guy. I also found a seam on the lower leg. It's two halves. And the upper part they present as a panel line, but the lower part there's a seam line there. And I use the same technique that I did on the shoulder. I just apply a little bit of glue and squeeze that together and get rid of the seam line. And there's a leg. I love those bell bottoms on those Xeon suits. It only took me about an hour, maybe an hour and 15 minutes to get the suit together, so it goes together very quick. And of course it's Bandai, it's a perfect fit. So this is one that's just a joy to build. Now another great thing about this kit is the wide variety of weapons that come with it. It's got everything from a shield to a big sword to a wrist-mounted cannon, and of course the main feature of it is this big giant Gatling gun. Now what's really cool about all of it is if you slip all the parts together, and they do fit, you just have to give them a little bit of a twist here and there. Once you get it together, you get this big honking shield, sword, cannon, Gatling thing that's a pretty massive weapon. And it's almost ridiculous in its size, but it's fun too. And I really like the look of it. That ammo drum is a nice addition. And Bandai actually puts a couple of little notches on the kit's shoulders so that it holds it up. Yeah, good job, guy. And with that, in just a very short time, I've got all the sprues emptied and the kit assembled. It's time to move on to priming and painting. Yeah, that's about enough of that. We won't do that anymore. With everything fully assembled, it was time to break down the model and put it into one of my plastic trays. I like using these sorting trays because it makes it really easy to keep track of all the parts and separate into left and right sides, and just makes it simple when I'm working on it. Taking it apart is just kind of the opposite of putting it together. Most of the parts pop right off, and there's generally not any trouble. Sometimes there's a little bit of difficulty getting sections apart. My goal here was to break it down into major assemblies because I wanted to airbrush the light blue and the dark blue and then brush paint all of the other details. Now, a couple of the things I did have to work on were those seam lines that I showed how to glue those up earlier. I start by scraping it with my hobby knife. That just kind of removes that bead of glue and plastic along there. All along the way, I constantly check with my finger to see how the seam feels, because that's going to be your best indicator when you've still got a gap. And then I just start a process of wet sanding the remaining pieces, I guess you'd say, of the join. And again, using my thumbnail, your fingernails are really sensitive to feeling any kind of bump there. So by just wet sanding and going from a 240 grade to a 320 grade to 400 to 600, it works that seam down until you get to where it's very smooth. And I can't describe, well, I guess describe's not the right word, but I can't. Wet sanding is so very beneficial. It works much better than dry sanding, even with the same grit. So I really urge you to look at wet sanding your model. Now on the lower leg, I kind of hurried things here, and I shouldn't have done that. I used the hobby knife to sand it down, and then I began my work with the sanding sticks, doing the wet sanding. But after I got a little further along, I saw that there was still a bit of a gap near the top of the join. Now, at this point, I should have used some filler to fill that in, but I thought, okay, let me scrape it away with my knife a little more. Well, all I ended up doing was introducing a gouge into that. However, I went to a heavier grade sanding stick because this was a large flat area, and I just resanded the whole thing smooth again. Which did take care of the problem, and after going through all the different grades, it worked out fine, but I probably should have just put in a touch of filler there. Now, another thing I needed to do was mask off some clear parts that are on the chest, and for this, I just used some Tamiya masking tape, and then I took a cocktail stick and outlined where the clear parts are so it was easy to see. Whenever I'm doing any kind of cutting like this, I always change to a fresh blade in my knife, because that way there won't be any snagging, and it works really well to use a fresh blade. And then I just lightly cut. I don't push down. I literally let the weight of the knife do the cutting, and it may take several passes from different angles, but once it's cut, you can remove the mask, and you've got a really good mask there for painting over, and just burnish it down. For priming, I like to use Badger's Stynylrez primer. It's an acrylic primer. It works really well. It's gunpla friendly, airbrushes nicely, and it just looks it looks really cool when it's on the model. There have been times that I've wanted to finish a model in nothing but primer, because it looks so cool. That satiny look is just a really nice finish, but it allows later paint to grip on very nicely, and whether you're airbrushing over it or brush painting over it. I chose black because I wanted a fairly desaturated look for the model anyway, and it gave me the option of establishing some shadows. Now for parts that move, such as the arm, I like to, hey, look at the white balance. I like to prime it with the part fully open and then bend it and prime it again. You'll see here I left the little horn partially attached so that if I needed to sand that later, I could. For the painting, I wanted to go with something like Canon color but a little more desaturated, so I used these paints from Tamiya, and I airbrushed the various parts. The XF23, or yeah, XF23 was used for the lighter blue, and you can see the difference in the kit plastic there. And then the XF18 was used for the darker blue, and here again you can see it's much more desaturated, not quite as dark a blue than the kit parts. You can see here that the masking worked perfectly. I haven't removed it yet, but it masked off those areas. I still need to paint part of the chest black, but I'll do that with a brush. Here's the waist parts, and again, I really like this desaturated look of these Tamiya paints. They were thinned with Mr. Color leveling thinner, which is kind of the secret sauce for getting these to go on well. You see I still need to paint some black there on the knee. And here's a comparison of the two colors side by side. Now I'll start by painting these black areas on the knees and the feet and a few other areas using German gray. I didn't want to go with pure black. I wanted something that gave me a little bit of space to have some deeper shadows if I wanted. So I put a little of the German gray in my palette, thinned it with the airbrush thinner and the airbrush flow improver, and stirred it up with the end of my paintbrush. I don't often use a paintbrush to stir just because I don't want to get the paint all up in the bristles. And then I just started painting this thin layer on. It took a couple of thin coats to get full coverage, but it goes on very smooth, and Vallejo paints are very good at building up opacity in just a couple of layers. And even when they're thinned fairly heavily, which these paints were, they work very well, so I really recommend them. But I just went through and continued painting all of the various parts that were dark gray, including the bottom of the feet, and that wrapped up the German gray painting. For the weapons, I wanted to use this Citadel lead belcher to give it a nice steely look. I like the way it looks over black primer. I wanted to start on the sword and give it kind of a more of a stippled look than necessarily a dry brushed look. Even though it's probably a little out of scale, I wanted it to have a rough, a very rough appearance to it. And I'll add later colors to sell that notion a little more, but you see how that turned out. I think it looks pretty cool. Again, it's a little out of scale, but I think it looks cool. For the gun itself, I wanted more of a streaky, brushed metal look, although again, in scale, it may not be quite appropriate, but here, again, I'm going more for a cool look than a scale look on this guy, and I just think that lead belcher over the black base looks really cool. And when you add later washes and other colors over this, it serves as a great foundation. And I did the other weapon parts, made sure to get them coated. I wanted to continue dry brushing. For the frame parts, I wanted to use sky gray, one of my favorite dry brushing colors. It's very versatile. And here I focused more on the edges. I just wanted this to be more of an edge highlight. It does suggest some weathering, and I'm okay with that, but my primary goal here is edge highlighting to make the detail show when the viewer's looking at it. I want them to see the edges. I want them to see the outlines of things. So this really helps with that. For the darker blue parts, I went with this Fenrisian gray. I thought it would stand out nicely. And again, this is It can suggest weathering, but it's more of an edge highlight to make the details pop out a little more. When you have these monotone colors like this, it can be very hard for the eye to pick up the details. So I went with that. Cold white was used on the lighter blue parts. It may seem a little stark, but when dry brushed on, it works fairly well on this light color. For the panel lining, I'm going to use this mechanical pencil. I like using mechanical pencils, one, because they're very friendly to the Bandai plastic, but two, it's just so darn easy to apply. You just draw them on. Now, it is a bit distinct. It is a very high contrast look, so do be aware of that if you're going to use the technique. But I think it gives a great look. And if you make a mistake, you just flip around to the eraser and clean it up and continue on with the work. So it's very flexible and very friendly. And you can see here how this finished leg piece looks. Very sharp, very nice looking panel lines, I think. And I use this technique a lot. And I just continue on around the rest of the mobile suit and get it drawn in. Even on the darker colors, it's dark enough to show up there. And I get this top part done. It's real easy, even in the little circles. Now I'm going to switch to putting on some grime on those panel lines, and I'm going to use this Starship Filth oil brusher. And I put a little in my palette. I like doing that because one, I don't have to dip into the tube continually, but two, it allows me to use a different brush so that I can have a little more control. And all I'm going to do is apply this around on the panel lines, and I'm not looking to be neat or precise or exactly even on every one. If I get a little more in some areas or a little less in others, I'm okay with that, because what I'm going for here is a grimy, random look to the panel lines. This is supposed to represent the beginnings of grease and dirt and other stains around the mobile suit. Once I've got that applied, it looks pretty rough at this point, as you see, but that's exactly what I'm going for there. Because once I go to the cleanup stage using a little bit of odorless thinner, I put some in my palette there. Then I grab some cotton buds and I dip one of the cotton buds into the odorless thinner and damp off a little bit of it on the palette. I don't want it super loaded. And I just start a process of bouncing around the cotton bud to clean it up a little bit. I let happen whatever is going to happen. I'm not trying to get everything looking exactly even and neat and precise. If it leaves some in one area and takes away more in others, I'm okay with that. I can always go back and adjust it later. But what I want here is the randomness that's going to be introduced by cleaning it up with this method. And it's real easy to do. I'm literally just bouncing it around where the oils are. And you can see it gives it, I think, a really cool look. It's random, it's streaked, it's grimy. Now there's going to be more oils and layering and acrylic products that go over this, but it's a great foundation for the very staining to come. Now, if there are some areas that you think need a little more cleanup, you just go in with a brush and some odorless thinner and you just do further blending. You don't want to flood the surface, but you simply clean it up and neaten it in the areas that you think it needs it. To start the chipping, I chose Vallejo Sky Gray for the black parts of the model, and I did all of the initial chipping, regardless of color, with a sponge held in a clamp like this. I like this sponge chipping method because it gives you a lot of control over the size of the chips, but it still looks random. On the feet, I went with this sky gray just because it was high contrast. No material reason, just simply for a high contrast look. On the rest of the model, the light and the dark blue, I went with this Fenrisian gray, which on the lighter blue parts was not real high contrast, but I was okay with that because I knew later that I would go back in and do some additional chips with darker colors. but I applied this again with the sponge, and there's no right or wrong answer. It's just however you want it to look. Once all the chipping was done on the model, I went ahead and started assembling all of the pieces. I like doing the initial chipping with the sponge while it's in pieces, I guess you'd say, because they're easier to get to. But once I get that finished, I like to go ahead and assemble the model so that I can begin treating it as a whole and seeing how things look as I'm putting them on the model, and how they look in relation to each other, not just kind of doing it in a vacuum, so to speak. For the darker chipping, I wanted to use some chipping brown from Vallejo's Mecha Color line. This is a nice browny, reddy color that can look like chipping, it can look like dirt, it can do a lot of different things. And what I did here was I used a very fine brush that is from, this is actually from the Army Painter line of brushes. And the size of the brush is not so important as the tip, really. And what I wanted to do was just add in some areas so that it would look like there had been additional chips on the lighter blue parts that just went down to the underlying material. I followed that up with some pencil chipping. Using a mechanical pencil for chipping is really a good idea in my mind. It's very precise, allows for very small chips, and you can get them wherever you want them and as fine as you would like to do. And it's real easy to apply. And again, I just put these over where the previously lighter chipping had been done. I wanted to do some streaking on the model, so I used this gray wash from Vallejo, and I get some on the brush and I wipe off most of it, and then I just start streaking it up and down. I could have used oils here and had a lot more control, but at this point I was kind of wanting to just get things moved along, and the acrylics dry very quickly. So when layered on like this, especially if you put several layers, it will give it a nice streaked look when it's all finished. And you can use multiple colors, but you don't want real high contrast in there. And if you see, there's just a very subtle shading that takes place, giving it some tonal variation from the wash. A second coat can be applied within just a few minutes. And again, it's just to vary the look of it. I was a little more sparse this time because that layered look gives the model a depth of finish that you can't get otherwise with just one coat. It really helps sell the notion of the size and what's happened to the model, in my opinion. I wanted to do a little bit of a burnt look on the end of the gun, and I'd already put on the blue color. Forgot to film it, and I started that as the first color. Then I went to this Druki Violet, a shade from Citadel, and I just went in with a brush and applied that around the perimeter of the gun barrel. Again, just trying to simulate a burnt effect, heat effect. And you can go back over this with additional effects to kind of blend it in. And then the final one was this red, well, you saw it, whatever it is. I can never pronounce half the Citadel color names. But this is a contrast paint, and I just finished up adding this color on, and you notice that I overlap it a little onto the violet color. And it just gives a fairly sellable heat effect. I wasn't going for anything too spectacular in this, and called that one done. Now it's time to add a little bit of rust tones to the model, and I used this Vallejo rust here. And what I was doing was just looking for some of the larger dark areas of chipping to work under the assumption that that underlying material was something that would oxidize in some way. I can clean this up, and I did with my finger, and that can be both to remove, if you get excess, it can be to remove excess, but it can also be to just kind of blend it in. If you do it quickly, it won't leave a fingerprint, and it's a good way of just adding some variation to the look of it. In some areas I went in and went a little heavier and actually painted some streaks of the rust to look as if the rust tones had run down a particular part of the model, and then just streaked those with my finger. I always feel like rust tones need a second color, so I went with this yellow ochre from the model Airline. And all I do here is just thin it up a little bit, and I put it over the other areas of rust. Sometimes directly over it, sometimes around it, sometimes in the middle. The point is, rust never is one color. It's multiple colors. Now on this scale, I thought that I could get away with 2 colors. But I just applied that around in areas that I thought needed it. And a few times, if I thought that I was missing some orange, I just, without even cleaning the brush, I went back into the orange and put that on right over the yellow ochre. So you can do kind of a wet on wet application, and they just blend together, and it just gives it a lot more variation. With those major components assembled and most of the weathering done, I decided it was time to get the whole mobile soat together so that I can do the final steps for the weathering and the finish and get this guy finished up. It's a very easy to assemble model. It's been one of my favorite Gunpla that I've built. Really not any complaints about the model at all. It's just a great kit with, as I've mentioned before, very few seam lines. I'd already painted the eye pink, so that's ready to go. All right, and here you can see he's almost finished. The chipping's done, the panel lining is done, and it's looking pretty good. It's just about to the point of calling him finished, but I still want to add some stains, some streaks as far as fluid streaks, and some dirt effects. To start off with the fluid effects, I went with these 2 colors from the Vallejo Mecha Color line. They're essentially a black color and a red-brown color. They are gloss, but that makes them look as if it's a liquid that's still, wet. So you can go back later and matte that down, but if you want it to remain glossy, it does that. I kept a little bit of Vallejo airbrush thinner off to the side just to clean with. And you can see, you just go in and apply this with your brush. This is not a subtractive process like working with oils and enamels, where you pull it off with thinners and things like that. This is an additive process. You paint it on where you want it. So it takes a little more of a careful touch because you can't go back and easily remove it. But I think it works very well, and the benefit is it dries very quickly. And you can see in this area I wanted to just add a little bit to the various hoses that provide the, I guess that's a power cable, just to look as if something leaked from there. And I switched over to the brownish color. No, this was still the black color. I apologize. And just added that in to make it look like it had leaked. And then I switched to the brown color just to represent a different kind of fluid, the idea of a different kind of fluid for the back of the legs. No big reason in my mind other than this is just a different fluid and it's coming out of a different place. And you can see that I just kind of kept applying it and let my imagination decide how this should look, and just went with some streaks and some randomness to sell the notion that this had been a fluid leak. For some dirt effects around the lower part of the feet and the legs, I went with this Vallejo Model Wash. It's a really good product to use for this. It goes on fairly opaque, but when it dries, its opacity drops way down and it gives some very convincing dirt effects. And you can use other dirt effects here, weathering powders or airbrush or whatever, but I just chose this because it's easy to apply and it dries really quickly, and it sells the notion, in my mind, of dirt around the lower part of the model. And I just dab it on like this and spread it around a bit. Once it dries, if I want to go back and add more, I just simply go back and add more and keep building that up until I get it looking like I want. I also wanted to do some splattering. And this is just getting your brush loaded up with the wash and flicking it against a toothpick like this or any other small object like that. And all that does is just simply literally splatters the model. I do it on the paper towel first to get off some of the excess and also make sure the pattern is what I want. And then I just start going around the model and adding that in to the feet. And you can angle where you're doing the splattering so it's easy to apply. And then you can see once that is added, it gives a pretty convincing look altogether of dirt and splatters and mud and dust and all sorts of other effects. A little bit of the soot color was needed from these Tamiya powders. You'll notice that I put down a piece of paper towel because this stuff will go everywhere. I gave up using the little brush. It's torn up, so I use a cotton bud now. But I just apply this to the end of the barrel. I don't use these weathering powders a lot because I don't like that they obviously look like streaked powders. But I think on the silver and with the black of the gunmetal look, I think it works here. When you're doing this, don't forget to get the end of the barrels, otherwise they'll shine. And it just gives it a little sooty effect to show that it has fired a little bit and it's been in use. That pretty much did it for the mobile suit. I always finish up the process by just giving him a good look, looking at every part of it and just seeing, is there anything I want to add or adjust? Like for example here, I thought, I wanted a little bit more chipping on the front of the leg like that. And so I went in with my mechanical pencil and did that. You could add streaks, you could add grime, anything at this point that you feel like the model needs is a great time to add it and just make adjustments so that it looks balanced and as a single unit. And that pretty much does it for the model. I've really enjoyed this model build. It's a great kit. I highly recommend it. I went for a simpler finish just because I was simply having fun with it. I wasn't trying to get too advanced, too fancy, just something to pass the time and make this little documentary of what I did. And I think it turns out fairly nicely though. You don't have to necessarily put in a huge number of steps to get a fairly good looking model. It's just a matter of doing a few simple things and layering them on top of each other to give you a reasonable depth of finish. And here you can see the feature that my son really liked when he gave it to me, that big honking gun and the shield and the sword all together. That's a lot of fun. Well, thank you so much for watching this video. Thank you for supporting the work that I do. There's links below to all of the social media outlets that I populate. And of course, there's Patreon links below, and I would appreciate it if you would consider supporting me on Patreon. I would be most grateful for that. And if you're already a Patreon supporter, then please continue doing so. In this time, it really helps if you are able to. And thank you very much for your support. I know that now is not the easiest time to be giving a few dollars away, but my family and I truly appreciate it. It is very needed and very appreciated. So thank you again for watching. Thank you if you're still watching at this point. And I hope you and your family are well. Remember, if you're not having fun in this hobby, you're doing it wrong. Happy day to you, friends. Bye-bye.